Sawadee Kap. Welcome to Thai Move Talk and another edition of Connections. I am your host, Brian Berlutic. Nothing happens in Thailand within a political vacuum. Everything is connected to a much wider geopolitical context. Here is a recent statement from the U.S. Embassy and Consulate in Thailand's website. It says, the United States began construction of a new annex on the existing U.S. Embassy Bangkok compound, which will support the continued expansion of U.S.-Thai diplomatic, security, and commercial relations and strengthen our ties with the Thai people. It also says, in more than 2 centuries of friendship, the United States and Thailand have strengthened cooperation in all sectors, from bilateral trade to international law enforcement to public health. The new annex will house U.S. agencies currently located in different facilities across Bangkok, centralize our existing operations, and further strengthen bilateral cooperation. And then it says, given Thailand's rise as a regional financial, media, logistics, and transport hub, and Bangkok's role as a host to international organizations, the United States has long used its embassy here as a hub for regional operations. They also claim that the U.S. Embassy staff in Bangkok have regional responsibilities, including dealing with refugees, but they don't mention that they're from conflicts the U.S. has created, like in Myanmar right now. They also claim that they're here to promote regional development, although while China builds roads, dams, bridges, power plants, and railways for the region, the U.S. only seems to fund groups protesting development rather than actually carrying it out. That doesn't sound like the sort of thing a friend would do. And that's the part I really want to focus on. This claim that the US is a friend of Thailand. Is the US a real friend of Thailand? Well, let's look out in the streets at the now daily violent Hong Kong-style anti-government and anti-monarchy protests. Let's look at how they are destroying Bangkok, the same city the U.S. Embassy wants to use as a regional hub to spread their friendship. These mobs are funded by the U.S. government through the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy. The protests are so ugly and destructive, and their goals of destroying Thailand's institutions so provocative, the U.S. has tried to distance itself from officially backing them, when they're not hosting protest leaders at the U.S. Embassy itself, of course. But here is another statement, also from the U.S. Embassy. It's titled, Statement Refuting Disinformation. It says, the United States government is not funding or otherwise providing support to any of the protests in Thailand. The United States does not support any individual or political party. We support the democratic process and the rule of law. But of course, this is not true, not even close. The U.S. is supporting the protests. The core organizations leading, supporting, and promoting the protests are all funded by the U.S. government. They are listed by name on the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy's website, together with the money amounts in U.S. dollars they receive annually from the U.S. government. This includes Thai Lawyers for Human Rights, whose lawyer, Anand Nampa, is literally one of the core protest leaders. Thai Lawyers for Human Rights also provides free legal services for other protesters and other protest leaders. So how is the U.S. not supporting the protests if they are funding organizations literally leading and supporting the protests? There are organizations like iLaw, also funded by the US government. They organized the petition to rewrite Thailand's entire constitution. This was one of the 3 core demands of the protests the US claims it is not funding. Yet the petition to push these demands was funded by the US government through iLaw. Then there are fake news websites like Prachathai and Isan Record. They both eagerly promote the protests, the protest leaders, and at times they are often found at the protests themselves. Again, funded by the US government via the National Endowment for Democracy. So obviously, when the US Embassy says the United States government is not funding or otherwise providing support to any of the protests in Thailand, that is an absolute lie. verified by just looking at the US government's own National Endowment for Democracy website. Now, about this claim that the US doesn't support any individual or political party, this is also a lie. US Embassy representatives accompanied billionaire opposition leader Thanathorn Juangroongruangkit when summoned by police. This was not only an open public display of support, the US Embassy claims it is not giving, it was also a blatant demonstration of foreign interference, contra to the UN Charter and international norms. What kind of friend is the US to Thailand when it backs violent subversion in Bangkok streets, then lies and says it is not? What kind of friendship exists when Thai people express concern about this US interference and the US calls them liars while denying documented facts? It's the kind of friendship that really isn't friendship at all. It is an abusive relationship where a violent, abusive, and exploitative partner tries to control the other, denying complaints of abuse but continuing to do it openly. It's also the kind of friendship the US wants to spread across all of Southeast Asia. This is what they want to use their giant facility in Bangkok to do, to spread this abuse, deception, and exploitation across the entire region. It's part of a wider, well-documented foreign policy objective of encircling and containing China. This is a document from 1965, taken from the US State Department's Office of the Historian's official website. It says, the February decision to bomb North Vietnam and the July approval of Phase 1 deployments make sense only if they are in support of a long-run United States policy to contain communist China. China looms as a major power threatening to undercut our importance and effectiveness in the world and, more remotely but more menacingly, to organize all of Asia against us. This was all the way back in 1965, and this sounds very similar to recent statements coming out of Washington about the supposed threat China poses. And down here in this same document, it identifies Southeast Asia as one of 3 fronts to a long-run effort to contain China. The US fears China will organize Asia against Washington and Wall Street, so the US is determined to organize all of Asia against China. If the US cannot put a client regime in power in Thailand or in neighboring ASEAN countries to cut ties with China, the US would settle for simply creating chaos and large groups of anti-Chinese political factions to ruin ties between ASEAN and Beijing. And we're seeing this every day. Shirts that say anti-Sinovac, protesters in Thailand waving Taiwanese independence flags or Hong Kong flags, or meeting with Hong Kong opposition leaders, or waving the flag of violent Uyghur separatists in a Bangkok intersection where violent Uyghur separatists killed 20 people. The US calls this friendship. If they called it what it really was, modern-day imperialism, it's likely Thai people would rather see the US Embassy's footprint in Bangkok reduced, not expanded. The US is a large, powerful, but extremely dangerous nation, and don't take my word for it, just ask the Iraqis, the Libyans, the Syrians, and all the Afghan friends the US left behind as they pulled out of Afghanistan just recently. Thailand's government really has few options in dealing with this directly, but indirectly, the governments of the region, and of course the people of ASEAN have many options to expose what the US is really doing behind the smokescreen of friendship. They can counter this by filling the space US-backed subversion is trying to use to ruin Southeast Asia with instead constructive solutions for local problems and building up real friendship with nations around the world who demonstrably want to just do business and build infrastructure. That does it for this week's edition of Connections for Thai Move Talk. See you next week. Sawadee Kap.